Hello, everybody, and welcome to this panel discussion session on contamination control strategy. We're joined today by 4 industry experts who are going to be discussing some of the key considerations when developing a CCS. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our expert moderator for this session, Dr. Tim Sandel, Head of QA XP Compliance at Bioproducts Laboratory. Tim has over 25 years experience of microbiological research and biopharmaceutical processing. He's also a member of several editorial boards, has authored 30 books on microbiology, healthcare and pharmaceutical sciences. He currently works for Bioproducts Laboratory in the UK, and he's a visiting tutor at both the University of Manchester and UCL. Before I pass to Tim, I just want to remind the audience, please submit your questions for our expert panel via the chat box on the right-hand side. We'll take a look at these in the course of the discussion. So now, Tim, over to you to introduce our panelists.
Okay, thank you very much, Caroline, and hello to everybody. And I hope you've had a great event so far. The agenda looks really, really good. And thank you for joining this panel on contamination control. And I was just thinking a little bit before we came on about how to sort of set the scene. So I just had a quick reminder of what Annex 1 is saying, and that there were sort of 6 fundamentals that jumped out to me, and maybe we can use these as sort of points to discuss and how they interact. But the first one is that the CCS extends to every aspect of our sterile manufacturing operations, and we could look about whether we want to extend that further. The second is that we need to base our activities on quality risk management principles, and there's a very strong direction that should be proactive assessments and then setting appropriate CAPA. We need to use scientific principles and methods and to be data-driven. We should be considering the validation of processes. We need to kind of conceptualize the CCS as an holistic set of interactive and interlinked processes, and the whole approach to the CCS can't be something that we do as a one-off and then put onto a shelf to gather dust. It's something that needs to be periodically reviewed and adapted to the life cycles of products and processes, and also be reactive to changes that we make in the process. So with that sort of scene setting, what I'd like to do is to introduce each member of the panel, and I'll ask them to say a few words, additional words about themselves, and any kind of key thoughts that they might have if they wish to, and then we'll move on to a series of questions. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Ed Tiswell, and it's been a pleasure to have known Ed for many years, and he really is a very thoughtful expert in the field of microbiology and sterility assurance, and Ed is executive director for QA at Merck, and he served for many years on PDA committees, including the editorial board and the USP expert committee on microbiology. So Ed, is there any more you'd like to say about your background and any thoughts on CCS in general?
Just to start off saying it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation to join this event. Very much appreciate that. I do know Fred, I do know Helen and Tim very, very well. Great friends, known them for a long time, and it's great to be with them on this discussion. Yeah, with respect to CCS, I guess contamination control strategies are really not new, although we think about Annex 1 early adopters really started putting together contamination control strategies about 20 years ago. But it was Annex 1 that really manifested this as a regulatory requirement. And it's absolutely, as you said earlier, Tim, it's core to Annex 1. And actually, if you count how many times it's mentioned the term CCS, or contamination control strategies, mentioned over 50 times actually in the 2022 version of Annex 1. Now, that being said, in 2014, the Pharmaceutical Healthcare Sciences Society published a really useful technical monograph 20, and this coined the term biocontamination, but it introduced this concept more broadly around contamination control strategy. And I definitely recommend anyone who's interested in this field to go to that technical monograph. Now, Annex 1 spurred PDA to publish TR90, and I think Fred may talk a lot more about that to us about what that looks like. But again, it's a very, very useful guide, and something I always go back to when I think about contamination control strategy. What else? When I think about contamination control strategies, there's quite a few different definitions out there that you can find, but they're all based upon the same common principles. First, that they're essentially a planned set of activities or controls based upon product process understanding, and that they operate cohesively to assure process performance and product quality. That's the whole emphasis around contamination control strategies. Although absent from that definition, risk is incredibly implicit to our consideration and our formation, development, and sustaining contamination control strategy. I think that's really important, and that's a topic maybe we want to come back to. I will also say that when we think about CCS and CC contamination control strategies, I would argue that you can think about it in terms of a strategy and a plan, and there's a huge amount of benefit in developing a strategy and a plan. And again, that's something maybe we could come back to about distinguishing what a strategy and a plan looks like, and why that could be useful for implementation. It's not widely thought about in those different terms, but that's something that that we've developed at Merck, and I've seen developed at one or two other firms as well. Lastly, although it's a regulatory requirement through Annex 1, there's boundless advantage of using contamination control strategies as a means of continuous improvement. Not only thinking about where we are today and what your product looks like today in one particular place, but broadly end to end and through the entire product life cycle. So it brings value way beyond what we think of meeting regulatory compliance. And within that spirit, and as suggested in Annex 1, contamination control strategies may be applied to other modalities as well, and that's another area that we could discuss as well, and certainly that I've got experience in terms of applying it to other product types or other manufacturing types beyond simply aseptic or sterile manufacture.
Okay, so thank you, Ed. That's some really great insights and scene setting things there. Okay, I'd like to now introduce Fred Ayres, who's the sterility assurance expert at Eli Lilly and Company. And Fred is also a tremendous contributor to PDA activities, as well as having great knowledge of sterility assurance quality and other technical issues relating to the world of pharmaceuticals. So Fred, could you happy to expand on your introduction and also give your initial thoughts on the CCS concept.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Appreciate it. And then kind of reiterate what Ed said. Appreciate everybody being on this. Great conversation piece. And whether we call it bioburden control strategy, sterility assurance strategy, contamination control strategy, I think everybody's had that around for a while, and it's nice to see Annex 1 kind of put that in the forefront of having that in place to drive process control and process improvements, which makes product quality even better long term. So I think that's one of the key things from Annex 1, and I believe that's what they were trying to drive. And then as Ed said, we worked on a technical report for the PDA. I was lucky enough to be a part of that task force. And the one thing I'll hit on that is the House of Contamination Control that is in that document. I think that's a really key piece for individuals to take and bring back to their own organizations, and you can kind of construct it however you want, but I think putting that in a visual concept is really important because it helps people visualize what contamination control is, and it really puts the focus on the foundation and the actual controls, and not just the monitoring piece, which I think is what everybody focuses on so much. I mean, I've been involved in this industry for 20 years, and every single audit that comes in, I think one of the first two questions that get asked, right, is, I want to see all your aseptic process simulations since we've been here last, and I want to see any grade A investigations since then, right? So they focus on the measures, but as individuals within our own enterprises or our own companies, right, from a firm perspective, you need to understand what are the controls and then what are the measures actually demonstrating about those controls. So I think, understanding that and helping visualize that helps everyone within the firm or the organization understand how that fits together. And that's a really key piece from my point of view.
Okay, no, that's good. It's often, I like that part of, the auditors asking one thing and seeing something, but all the activity behind that, and it's really important. Okay, so the third and final member of the panel is Helen Gates, who is strategic technical consultant lead at Ecolab, and Helen has tremendous experience of contamination control, environmental monitoring, aseptic processes, equipment, water systems, all of those elements that we need to consider when we're looking at the CCS. And Helen has a great level of experience of having visited a whole range of different pharmaceutical companies. So that experience to draw upon as well. So Helen, is there any more you'd like to say about yourself or your initial thoughts on the CCS concept?
Yep, thanks for the introduction, Tim. Real pleasure to be on the panel with everybody. I think I would say it's a really good topic to have as a panel discussion. My experience from visiting lots of Ecolab's customers is CCS feels like something huge and can feel quite overwhelming, and the thought of performing that implementation can be very daunting. But a lot of this, as other panelists have said, some of it's already in place, and it's just thinking more about how you can bring all of that together and really focusing on the benefit of doing that, because as a understanding appreciation of what your contamination risks are and why you've put things in place to manage those risks, and bringing the interrelation of all of those different elements in the process together to have that clear strategy and that clear plan, it brings such benefits. For those that have been involved in sterility failures, process simulation failures, grade A deviations, it's a hugely intensive process with a significant impact on business. And so if you can be more strategic, put more proactive thought into minimizing those possible events, then absolutely there is a really, really clear benefit to do that. So I think there's lots of good reasons to a contamination control strategy. And I think, great for us all to have this collective discussion about it, just to think about, so it's not so overwhelming and daunting for people of how they might implement that process.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you for those introductions. So just a reminder to people who are watching this, this is an opportunity for you to put your questions or opinions on the CCS, and particularly for anyone out there who wishes to benchmark what they're doing, or has concerns about how all this fits together, then please pose your questions, and we can put these to the panel who have, as you've seen, this tremendous amount of experience. But we begin with a question that hopefully some people will be running through their minds and things, and this is really whether there's any commonality in the types of gaps or problems that either you've come across in other people's CCSs, or when you've attended conferences that people have asked particular questions. Are there the areas that perhaps some organizations are struggling with the most when they're trying to put their CCS process together? So with each question, I'll ask each one of the panelists in turn. So Ed, if we could begin with you. So the question is, are there any gaps or common issues with CCSs that you think people struggle with the most, or have greatest challenge in filling?
Yeah, really good question. I would say that I think Helen alluded to this. The actual process of putting together your CCS or CCP, whatever you want to call it, does bring to the forefront those gaps, and merely the fact of pulling together information that you've already got and already been using for years and years into that plan or that strategy really bubbles up those opportunities. That's the first thing. When we've implemented it globally, we've found that happens every single site. Every single site is different. Every single site brings up their own gaps. What's really important is not to lose sight of those. And the value of CCS is really that if you sustain it as a living document or a living process, it will continue to identify those gaps. And that's not something to shy away from. Integrating CCS into change control, into deviation management is essential. And it's something you've really got to embrace, that you will always find opportunities for improvement. And that's the boundless value that is associated with CCS. I do think that generally people think of CCS, they call it, and again, I said this in my sort of intro, about contamination control strategy and plans. There is a strategy which is more principle based, and then there are plans which are more detail based. So if you're implementing across a large firm or even a small organization, setting out the principles within a strategy I think is very valuable, and then the detail in the plans. Fred laid out exactly about TR90 and the great details in there, which help you as a roadmap to writing the plans. And I think Fred also said about this visualization of the framework as the sort of strategy. Dividing those is valuable, and I think there's a gap because firms just push all those things together. In a practical sense, a strategy, if you have that documented in your firm, a strategy is probably not going to get changed too much, but your control plan might, because you're always in the cycle of continuous improvement. So having your control plan and strategy separate helps in change control, because you don't want to keep going back to elements of your control strategy and going through the toil of change control, which we all love. in terms of strategy as well. What else can I tell you? Broadly, what we found in terms of CCS is that although quality risk management and risk assessments have been with us through Q9, ICH Q9 for a long time, they're often not sufficient at our or other people's manufacturing sites. And CCS is fundamentally based upon understanding of risk. So again, going through the whole process, it bubbles up these gaps, especially around risk assessment.
Okay, no, that's really good, and I really like the way you kind of connecting that to the risk element, and it's sometimes in the way that organisationally some companies have their risk department under one sort of part of the organisation, and their strategy assurance under another, and it's about how they fuse together. I think is a really key point. Okay, so move to Fred. Fred, if you could expand upon the sort of issues and gaps that you've experienced.
Yeah, so I think Ed brought up some really good things. Excuse me, but the two things that I would say that are difficult from a certain point of view, right, are and Tim, I think you hit on this a little earlier when you were talking about it, right, is potentially the size of a CCS, right? There's so much information that you can include in that, and how do you make that concise, to the point? How do you identify what the strategy is? And then I like what Ed was saying about having a plan, right? And you have your strategy, and then you have your plan. You need to make sure those are linked. You need to make sure all of the organizations within the firm understand their role within both of those, and make sure those are out there. So I think that's one of the key things from that standpoint of how do you identify, what is going to be there, so you don't have a 40 page document, right? Because nobody wants to read that, right? But how do you have a very concise, to the point document? So I think the size is one of the things, and then one of the most important things that I believe that is there is governance, right? Making sure that you have the right people involved in the governance, you have the right ownership at the right level, and you have the right part of the organization that can drive that governance, and have it be based upon the strategy and the execution plan. And one of the things that Ed hit on that I'd reiterate, right, is that it's all about continuous improvement, right? It's like getting better every single day, being better today than you were tomorrow. Than you were yesterday, and being better tomorrow than you are today. And it's like that continuous journey. And sometimes I think we have an event, and we find the root cause of that event, and we close it, and it's like, okay, we're done. And it's like, you're not really done, right? You're continuously improving, and to build that into your governance structure, I think is extremely important.
No, that's a really good point, and it's all about getting the right people in the right place. And governance, again, is something that it always seems very strong for things like business planning and certain sides of the organisation, but sometimes could be neglected elsewhere. Thank you, Helen. So you obviously visit lots of different sites. Are there any kind of common gaps or issues that you've experienced?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting talking about the documentation structure and the strategy versus plans. So what we're seeing with the service that we offer from a consultancy point of view, we are invited to go review people's contamination control strategies. So we get to see what practically that they've put in place. And what I see from a kind of documentation structure approach is some differences around, as Fred alluded to, is trying to do everything in the one document, which can make it quite difficult to follow, and then also leads to potential gaps because of the size of the document, the kind of missing sections. When you look at Annex 1 on that list of bullet points, that everything that needs to be considered, I think we're sort of focusing on, did I hit that bullet point, almost like a compliance exercise, and checking that off, and not necessarily going to that next level of detail to make sure that they're considering the risks within there. For those that so I've seen some documentation where it's almost like a heading that then just refers to another document. So it's a 2-page contamination control strategy that just points out. And the gaps I see there are around risk assessment and different approaches being taken by different groups of an organisation in their risk assessment approach. And then that can lead to sort of some risks that maybe aren't as high priority being considered high priority just because there's a conflict of how people have gone about doing that assessment. And Ed talked about that element of risk assessment is so key within this process. So taking the time to agree the strategy around risk assessment and what risks, a scoring system, or, are you going to use the same tools of risk assessment, and thinking about those principles up front to put that structure in place to support that. Now, if I would say from a details area, so Ecolab's business is around cleaning, disinfection, biodecontamination practices. And so what I would say when we review people's strategy around that, the gaps we see, which is another sort of key topic in Annex 1, is about the management of residues, that's not considered as a contamination risk and captured within those strategies. But also the link to validation, and then also where I would see the continuous improvement side of validation is continuous process verification with cleaning and disinfection. I think it's a relief to get your cleaning and disinfection strategy in place, get cleaning and get active within the rooms, but then thinking about the other quality process that's part of the CCS is how is that validated, and how are you ongoing demonstrating that is meeting your contamination control needs. So those are the kind of areas that I've seen when I've visited sites, the gaps.
Okay, no, that's great insight. Thank you, Helen. And I do agree. The point about residues, I think we are starting to see some regulators pitch that in. So, and I think that was something that had greater prominence in one of the earlier drafts of Annex 1, and then not so much in the finished version. Okay, so I think the second point I'd like to pitch, which I think everybody has mentioned, risk and the importance of risk assessment. But obviously there are different approaches. That there are different tools. There are different philosophies by which we can measure risk throughout the CCS, both in terms of potential gaps or in terms of assessing the impact of different sources of contamination. So I think it would be an interesting thing to sort of put across experiences of how we actually look at the different elements of the CCS and attempt to assess the impact of different risks. So if we could start again with Ed, and Ed, if we could get your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, when we think about risk, and I'm going to talk about microbiological risk. Think about microbiological risk. My immediate thought always goes back to Bill Wyatt and Tim Eaton. So around about 2004, they published some, I think, 3 or 4 really great papers on understanding microbiological risk. And if you go, I strongly recommend you go back to those look at those papers by Bill Wyatt. He was at Glasgow. Is he still there, Tim? I've sort of lost track of.
I think he has like a sort of I think he's retired, but I think he has an association still.
Yeah. So I know Tim's still with AstraZeneca. Great guys, and they really laid out a fantastic framework about thinking about microbiological risk and how you can actually sort of quantify it beyond, beyond a sort of fluffy way of calling it high, medium, and low. Fundamentally, they sort of laid the framework for thinking around microbial ingress, microbial proliferation, and then retention or microorganisms staying within an environment or in your manufacturing process. when you think about risk assessment in our realm about microbiology and microbiological risk, boiling it down to those three elements is really key to really getting a valuable assessment of risk. So thinking about how microorganisms can access either your manufacturing environment, how they can access your manufacturing process, or even the product that's in its primary and secondary containers. So ingress, and then where can microorganisms proliferate and grow within the process, how they might sustain themselves or retain in a manufacturing process as well. So thinking about risk in that very principled way, and not worrying too much about what tool you use, whether it's a PHA or whether it's an FMEA, I think is the most important learning that I've seen. When you think about risk in those principal terms, then you can really link very, very clearly to the controls that Annex 1 really wants you to look at and think about. So think about how microorganisms can access something. Then we're talking about containment, we're talking about environmental classification, all those elements that are going to feature in parts of your contamination control plan. And again, when you think in those principal terms about risk and control, ingress, proliferation, and then retention, that really should feature in terms of a strategy. And then you execute in your plan or your document, and being able to list out and describe in your narratives exactly how your controls relate directly to either ingress, proliferation, or retention.
Okay, no, thanks, Ed. That's really good ideas, and I would echo the references to the Bill White, Tim Eaton materials, and also Ed himself has done some great things around risk assessment. I think there was some stuff he did with Bernard McGarvey, was it, around risk modelling, which was also worth checking out as well. Good material. Okay, so if we could move to Fred, and Fred, have you got thoughts on how we can apply risk, and in terms of how we can sort of measure or at least contextualize the risks that we would come across through the CCS?
Yeah, I agree with everything Ed said, right? I believe, the evaluation of ingress, proliferation, and retention, right, are very important. The other thing that I would focus on related to the CCS, right, is when you think about contamination control, right, it's where are you preventing contamination ingress, right? And so you're evaluating what is the potential ingress, but also be able to list and identify all those things that are preventing that ingress. And then also associated with that, look at there's two other things that I would call out there, right, is not only preventing it, but if it would ingress, what are you doing to remove that contamination that would be there? And then after that, right, the other thing that you could be looking at through your analysis is how are you mitigating that, right? Are there other things that can be done to mitigate that the risk of that contamination? So I think, related to ingress, those are the three key things that I would recommend focus on, because that really focuses on that contamination control versus some of those other things related to validation or qualification of the controls or the monitoring of those controls. So really boil it down to the actual contamination controls, and where are you preventing, mitigating, or preventing, removing, or mitigating contamination that would potentially be present. I think those are the three things that I would focus on as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I like the prevention, removing, mitigating. We could try and keep that as in the forefront. That's really good. Helen, what are your thoughts on sort of the risks and how we can sort of define and evaluate them?
Mm-hmm. So I think from a what's been discussed previously, talking about the ingress, the prevention, the management of risks, I think the only other thing to add on is really thinking about the consequence of that risk. So from a risk point of view, is and this is where the tools come in, is thinking how that consequence then allows you to determine your mitigation. So if you are using some tool to give some grading of the how worried should I be factor, then that allows you to then put the appropriate mitigations in place. And I think as well that can drive probably an advantage that maybe isn't the first intended purpose of a CCS, in that because you're using data-driven, science-based processes, sometimes we over-implement contamination control measures, and having this more thought and using science and data, then you apply the correct level of mitigation to the correct level of risk. So I think there is an opportunity that the CCS can be used for that as well.
Okay, no, that makes that makes sense, and I think making sure that we're using data as well, and sometimes we have a lot of information at our disposal. We're not necessarily always looking at it and making good use of that. Okay, so we may well come back to risk if we have time in a little bit. But one of the other things that was kind of, again, more stronger in some of the earlier drafts of Annex 1, and again, it got a little bit diluted, was the sort of push with rapid methods, and also with rapid and alternative methods. We can also consider other ways to capture data, maybe through digital tools and so on. And sometimes there's a little bit of a bewildering choice of different technologies emerging. So if we return to Ed, Ed, do you have any particular thoughts, and are there particular ways that sort of newer technologies, be they classed as rapid microbiological methods or digital data capture tools, or other technologies we can draw upon that might help, and to what degree are they necessary for the CCS?
Yeah, that's it's a good question, and the whole topic around rapids has been very popular and remains very popular. I will say that you've got to be careful when you implement rapids. Certainly in my experience, you've got to be really clear about the value they bring. We're all used to the compendial methods, which are archaic, right? They definitely need retiring at some point. But again, you've got to be really careful about how you implement rapid technology, and especially how it's going to integrate into your manufacturing environment. Fully digital processes are great, I think, in terms of microbiology, and what we do in the QC lab that's related to CCS. To me, the biggest value is around automation. The biggest value in terms of economy, efficiency, retiring non-compliances that are associated with human beings is essentially automation. And rather than the rapid technology, I think the biggest value is bringing in automation. If you think about the clinical environment, clinical labs handle a huge amount of analyses, microbiological analyses. They're highly automated. They've removed a huge amount of people from that process. So rather than think about rapids, I prefer to think about more holistically and think about automation, integration with your enterprise systems, whether those digital enterprise systems, you think about LIMS, and then the end of it is the rapid technology, or the analytical aspect of it. So I think when you say about rapids, that's how I think about it. And I think it's just a means of achieving one aspect of CCS. But again, you've got to really think about how you implement in your firm, and what systems you have in place in your firm, and what value it's going to bring. And to me, automation's the biggest value in terms of compliance, economy, efficiency, and assuring quality.
That's some really good points there, and I think not enough people always necessarily stand back and have a think about what is this technology, what am I going to do with it, what value is it really going to deliver, and what can I do with the data at the end of it as well. So that's really nicely put. Fred, what thoughts have you got about different technologies and how they can benefit or not the CCS?
Yeah, I think the key thing, right, is that at least rapid or alternative methods were, specifically stated in the annex. So I think that's a really good step forward, because the previous annex, not really so much. And you're right, Tim, they kind of took some things out of there that were in the previous versions for whatever reasons, but at least it's supportive. And so from an annex perspective, that's really good. But I think the key thing is to look at your contamination control strategy and understand, going back to what we talked about before of what is your strategy right now, and what can you add to that strategy that is beneficial, right? Don't put something in there that's not beneficial, right? Or that doesn't have the correct value purpose to ensure that you can get the product to the patient in a much more efficient way. So Ed hit on automation, right? Whether that automation can be in the laboratory itself, whether that automation can be done, on a utility system, in a manufacturing environment, however that can be done. Look at that and then understand how that fits into your contamination control strategy. How are you going to qualify and validate that? How are you then going to be using that data, right? And if you have something that is, let's say, continuously creating data, let's see, most firms have online TOC or online conductivity testing, right? So we don't think of those as rapid methods, but it's continuously creating data for you. And how are you using that data to evaluate your overall utility system from a contamination control perspective, right? So you can utilize something like that. How does that work with the other systems that you have? If you're going to put a new system on that utility system, what does that look like? How are you managing that? How are you utilizing that data? And then with the data, the other thing that you'd want to think about and work with your firm's IT organization is, can you develop some machine learning from that standpoint, where you can develop maybe algorithms based upon the data as it's coming in, that you can then react or have the system react in its own right of mitigating or managing a contamination event that is outside of what is normal. And the thing that I've always said when I talk about rapid methods is, one of my favorite movies is Minority Report, because it talks about the future, and it's like, even now you can see some of those things coming in, right? Cars that drive themselves, so much data coming in, targeted ads and all that stuff, right? But the coolest thing about that movie in my mind is when Tom Cruise's character gets his eyes replaced. And it's like, the world didn't change. He just sees the world from a different point of view, right? Because his eyes have changed. And really, you need to think about your systems. If you're implementing rapid methods, is your process really isn't changing. You're just you're looking at it a different way. So that data is going to look different, and it doesn't mean that it's bad. It's just different, and you have to understand that. And I think that's the big fear that a lot of firms have, is like, oh, is this going to show that we're bad? And to me, that all leads back to your contamination control strategy. If your strategy is robust and proper, then that data is just a different way to look at your process, and you need to understand what that data has been telling you. So I think that's the other thing I would think about, of what is the data telling you, and then how are you interpreting that data, or how are you using mechanisms, machine learning, or if we get to a point where AI is capable of doing that. Because even like Chat GPT and all that, it's not really artificial intelligence yet. It's more machine learning than artificial intelligence. I mean, at some point in time, maybe we'll get to the Terminator world, but not right now.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's really interesting. And I I liked that you mentioned integration, which I think then follows on from what Ed was saying about the laboratory, and what are we actually going to do with the data? I think that's an important consideration as well. So, Helen, what are your thoughts on different technologies?
Yeah, so I agree that it is great to see that there is some element of reference to rapid microbiological methods mentioned in Annex 1. I think the industry needs that level of endorsement because of that concern of new types of data or new information making things look bad. And I think that's, there's a general fear that's going to lead to more product rejections. So it is good that endorsement's in place. I would say when I visit, or my colleagues, we go out visiting different sites, we don't see a great deal of rapid micro methods out there now implemented. So there clearly is a concern in the industry. But when we don't talk about the pharmaceutical industry and we just talk about the global sort of digital revolution, it seems to me that there is so much opportunity there, so much technology that could be embraced to allow us to capture information. I mean, yes, integration, you mentioned it before. I do see that when I visit sites that they do struggle with the connectivity of, I've got one software platform pulling this piece of information on, and I've got another one there, I've got a LIMS system, SAP, how do they all talk to each other? And that would be the wonderful place to get to, is that your contamination control strategy feedback loop for continuous improvement is this one system that pulls everything together, and that you can see that data, learn from it. And following on from what Fred was saying there with the leap forward with machine learning and risk prediction, that would be incredible, wouldn't it? That you can take that, something's just, I don't know, texting you an improvement idea because of an algorithm that you can then go and implement it. I think it's definitely the future is there, but it's going to take a lot of support from regulatory bodies, from industry bodies, to build that confidence that people are willing to take the leap to do that. And I think it's probably still going to be a bit of a slow burn. I would like to see it move faster, because I think there's real benefits from that. Not just in monitoring systems, even in sort of like digital validation systems, it's great to see those appearing as well, to kind of capture that process in a digital way, and then be able to use those as setting the standard to then feed back data to from your routine monitoring. So yeah, I think there's lots of opportunity with introducing technologies, but almost as a kind of a collective industry, we need to support each other to kind of make that happen on a wider scale than it is now. It's great when you do see the groundbreakers just going for it and implementing it, but yeah, it'd be nice to see it a bit wider.
Okay, no, thanks, Helen. And there's one word that you said that I thought was really important, and that was learning. And again, I think it's connecting to that whole thing about actually looking at what some of these tools and technologies are producing, and reacting to them, and learning from them. So that's really great. Thank you. I'd like to kind of broaden the discussion a little bit now, because I'm conscious that we'll have some listeners who are not either not working in sterile manufacturing, or working in facilities that may run two different types of products, or have other interests. So one of the things that Annex 1 says in the introductory part is that elements of the annex, and in particular the CCS philosophy, can be applied to other aspects of manufacturing, and there's been discussions in the world of sort of non-sterile pharmaceuticals, or other processes. So I'd like to ask the panel what their thoughts are on adopting the CCS for other modalities of manufacturing, or with non-steriles in particular. So if again, we'll start with Ed, and if you're happy to share your thoughts, Ed.
Yeah, read that section of Annex 1 really carefully, because it says words to the effect that if a firm wishes to, it can apply certain principles or concepts, such as contamination control strategy, where they see fit. However, if you so do, you are going to get inspected and gauged against those when we come to visit you. So by no means, if you want to adopt those principles or concepts that are specific to sterile manufacture in other modalities, by all means do, but it's your choice. You don't have to. I'll say that Merck, our firm, we're adopting those same principles and concepts in all our modalities, whether it's sterile, low bioburden, or non-sterile. The difficulty is that understanding how to interpret through the lens of, say, non-sterile manufacturing, those principles and concepts that are laid out specific for sterile. And they're very, very different realms. If you walk into a sterile manufacturing site, it looks completely different from a non-sterile manufacturing site. The principles, the controls, the whole emphasis around microbiological control in non-sterile is hugely different. Understanding that and trying to bridge is really key and critical. So one thing that I recommend, if you so choose, or a firm chooses to adopt those principles, look at the different points that are laid out in Annex 1. I think I counted how many key parts or key points in Annex 1 relate to microbiological control. And there's something like 396 items in there that are very, very key targeted requirements around microbiological control. If you take those 300, almost 400 items and look at them and then think, okay, how are they going to compare in a non-sterile site? I think you've got to do that, because some of them do, some of them do not translate. So bridge, if you're going to do that, I'd recommend you lay out firstly a rationale document where you look at those principles, those almost 400 items, and say, we are going to translate what's in Annex 1 to a non-sterile or low bioburden, but this is how we as a firm or as a stakeholder or what have you are going to do it. And this is why we're going to use these items. And this is why we're not going to use other items. If you fail to do that and just simply pick it up, it leads to a huge problem. So Annex 1 is really great because it lays out those principles, but you've got to really understand how they translate into, say, a non-sterile or low bioburden environment. You can't pick them up and put them in there. You've got to somehow bridge, and you can do it. Annex 1 says if you so wish to do it, do it. And it gives you the opportunity to lay out exactly how you're going to do it. So from a principle standpoint, again, lay out your strategy really clearly from the beginning. If you lay out a strategy, then you can run through all those items that are all those 400 details that are in Annex 1, excuse me, and hit them on the head in terms of whether they're applicable or not in non-steriles. But yeah, definitely a fan, definitely recommend using the same concepts of CCS, CCPs in other modalities.
Okay, no, thanks. That's really useful, and it's always it's interesting to know that that's a kind of a path that the Merck have embarking upon as well. So it's interesting to see how bits of the Annex 1 are being expanded more fully. Fred, what are your thoughts on the expansion of the CCS concept and the non-sterile question?
Yeah, I would just reiterate what Ed said, and I think the key thing to hit there is to go through each of those items and identify, is this applicable or not, and be very clear about the applicability, right? There may be some things where it's like, this is not applicable at all, and very clearly state that. And I like, Ed's idea of a rationale document. I think that's important. The other thing that I would add in there, right, is the understanding that the CCS helps drive that continuous improvement. So you may identify a point there that is a gap, right, and it helps you drive that from a continuous improvement standpoint to close that gap, and help drive some process improvement. So I think it's very important to take CCS and those different modalities, but just make sure that you're clearly identifying if it's applicable or not, or those contamination control perspectives from Annex 1 are applicable for that process or not, and then make sure you're using it to drive continuous improvement.
Okay, no, thank you. And I think that point about continuous improvement is really key. Helen, what's your experiences?
So I have actually been working with a European company this year, and they came to us wanting to harmonise their contamination control strategy across non-sterile and sterile medicines for the veterinary group, and so they wanted us to kind of harmonise the approach right across a group of sites for cleaning and disinfection. But really, the advice is very much linked to sort of Fred and Ed's comments there of you, if you are going to go through that approach, then you have to be clear why you've selected that approach and what that then means. And we ended up working with them almost to justify not harmonizing, but to justify doing the right thing for the right outcome for their cleaning and disinfection programs. For example, in tableting rooms, not selecting sterile disinfectants. If you're going to put all of that additional tasks protection in place for the security of the disinfectant, is that really going to have a strong outcome for that area? So supporting them to maybe make different choices, but as part of a strategy, having that clearly defined why you're taking those approaches. So we are seeing that, being asked to for other modalities, considering when Annex 1 doesn't apply to them, that how they could use it, certainly in the areas of cleaning and disinfection, contamination control strategies.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to build on something that Ed mentioned at the beginning, which was about sources of guidance, and kind of ask sort of a twin part question. So it would be, because if people are struggling, where can they go to get advice? So what standards and other kind of things that have been put out there are particularly useful, and also, is it something that that as a company people should struggle and do themselves, or are there certain things that, say, suppliers can contribute to? So it's sort of the if you like, I'm not on my own, I can look here or ask here, and what advice you give for people in that context. So again, if we could start with Ed in that regard, and Ed, if people join late, if perhaps you could reiterate the PHSS and PDA guidance that you mentioned at the beginning as well.
Yeah, the Pharmaceutical Healthcare Science and Society generated Technical Monograph 20. It was published in 2014, way before Annex 1 2022. And I do think, maybe you can confirm this, Tim, I think we had some EMEA inspectors on the board of the panel that generated.
Certainly, yeah, Andrew Hopkins, I think, definitely.
Yeah. So I think there is a line of sight between that technical monograph 20, which is on biocontamination control, and Annex 1. There is a continuity of thinking that I think originated with PHSS. That's a really good document, and few people use it. I strongly recommend you getting hold of a copy. It lays out all the points that you will need around contamination control strategy out through a different lens than, say, PDA Technical Report 90. Both are incredibly valuable sources of information. Equally, I would go back to, there's quite a few ICH documents that are incredibly useful in this respect. Certainly Q9, because it's about risk assessment and risk management. I think that's been revised. I think it's I can't remember now whether it's been released. It's about to be released, or the new revision is coming out, and maybe Tim or Helen or Fred know exactly whether that's out now or not.
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah.
Yeah. So I would definitely go to those three elements. I would also not be too worried about thinking about what other people have done. I'd resort to principled thinking, and what the fundamental basis of risk is. And we start off talking about ingress, proliferation, and retention. If you think in those terms, and you keep going back to the folks who are implementing a manufacturing site, and you keep reinforcing and saying, okay, when we're thinking about control and control strategies, what's the risks? What's the risk of it accessing? What's the risk of it growing or dividing? What's the risk of it being retained? You'll come out with a control plan that's really meaningful. In order to tackle that, I think it's incredibly valuable to go to some useful research papers on those topics. So that, again, when you think about how organisms can get vectored into a process, don't worry too much about technical monograph, the technical monograph from PHSS 20. Don't worry about PDA TR90. They'll give you the framework. But when you're thinking about the science underpinning the risk, do a little bit of research and find out exactly what people have found about in terms of sources of microorganisms and how they're vectored in for ingress, and think about literature that describes how or if microorganisms can grow in those environments too. So when you talk about references, PHSS Technical Monograph 20, PDA TR90, but do your homework as well. Go back and look at the literature that's supporting the fundamentals about what you're trying to achieve.
Okay, thanks, Ed. That was a useful recap of those things. And I think actually just taking a little bit of time sometimes to read around, do a little bit of research can make all the difference. So that's really good advice there. Fred, what sources of guidance or in discussions with suppliers or those sorts of things would you consider?
So I think I think the key thing, and Ed hit on this, right, is to have that principle or critical thinking, right? Is don't go out looking for like a one-stop shop, right? Because your process is different than other processes, right? So you need to leverage, the thing I'll always go back to is the PDA Technical Report 90. I think it gives a good framework. It gives a good way to visualize a CCS. But it's how do you take that and make that your own for your process and how you're trying to control your manufacturing processes. And then the other thing is leverage research, right? And that research can be data that already exists out there, but it also can be leveraging your suppliers, right? So if you're using disinfectants, Helen works for Ecolab, or if you're using an Ecolab disinfectant, right? Work with them to have that information available and figure out how that works in there. If you're using reusable garments and you're working with a supplier, what does that look like? How does that fit into your overall contamination control strategy? So, to me, it's about doing that due diligence and understanding the interconnection of all those pieces of your contamination control strategy and doing that research, because there's not a one-stop shop for everything out there. Ed brought up the PHSS document. We have the technical report from the PDA. ECA has a really good document as well that's out there, right? So they're out there, but it's how do you take those and make those yours for your process? Because it's not just a cut and paste activity. You have to understand from a technical depth and breadth perspective your process, because you're the one that's going to have to explain your overall strategy during an inspection. Whether that's an internal audit or an external audit, doesn't matter. You still need to be able to explain that and how all of those pieces fit together.
Okay, thank you. And I think that's that's a really good piece of advice, because obviously there are some courses out there, but every process is different. And if you just go and take someone else's, go on a course and just put all those bits into your own system. You can't really explain to a regulator how it really relates to your facility and how everything fits together. So that's really sound advice. Helen, in terms of other sources and I guess in your case in particular about working with suppliers and things like that, what advice can you offer?
So I think it sounds a bit like a sales pitch for come and use some consultancy with Ecolab, but I think it's a really fair comment and a fair expectation that if you have an approved supplier that's providing you with critical elements that support your contamination control strategy, is to expect something of them, is to expect them to be able to provide you the data or the expertise, some guidance of how what you're using from them relates into the contamination control strategy. So I think we should expect our suppliers to support and help through that process. In general, I would say, at the beginning, I said about a general sense of feeling overwhelmed, and I think what I see is larger organizations that have what I call above site technical support. They seem to be able to lean on that. They maybe have a bit more of a process that they're going to adopt. But I do see individuals on site that have been tasked with, can you do the contamination control strategy? And I think my advice to those people, if you're one of those, is you're not alone, and you shouldn't be alone, and you shouldn't be afraid to push back to your organization to say, no, this is a collective exercise that we need to bring multiple resources together to execute. And really, agreeing very much with the previous comments, that also just take that breather to research and look at what different approaches there are, and selecting the right ones for your right processes.
Okay, thanks, Helen. I think there's a really key message there is that there is a lot of expertise out there, and someone like yourself who does have the opportunity to visit lots of companies, there's lots of different bits of advice, and it's all about building it together and integrating some of these things. But things like Fred said as well, it needs to be relevant for your site, and as you say, Helen, you can't just expect someone to come along and write chunks of the CCS for you. It's got to actually relate to where we are. So we are getting near the end of the session, but just wanted to ask one more question of everybody. And it's kind of a reverse question. So you've all given really great advice on how to put a CCS together and all the important things. But I just wondered if you could say perhaps what the biggest mistake that you've encountered. It doesn't necessarily have to be something you've personally done or something your workplace has done, but it might be talking to people at conferences or in other forum. But it in some ways, looking at our errors and learning from our mistakes is also a very good way of making sure that we're building something stronger for the future as well. So if we use this as the final question, and we start with Ed again. Ed, what's the biggest mistake you've come across in relation to the CCS?
To be honest, I think Helen and Fred have mentioned some really salient points, and I think if I try and sum it up, it's failing to really think about what Annex 1 is driving you to do, rather than just taking it at face value. Annex 1 is encouraging you to think about the controls in place, or encouraging you to think about the risks. It's asking you to go through a process, and that process of implementation of a CCS and a control plan is what they're really wanting you to do. It's written in terms of instructional, saying you really need a CCS CCP, but the entire process of going through it is the most important thing. So failing to embrace that is the biggest mistake you can do. Failing to think about going through a principled way of going about it, just saying, I'm going to tick the box because Annex 1 requires me to do it, and I'm just going to do it in this way, and putting it on the shelf, I think you started to gather, as you started us off, Tim, and saying it's going to gather dust there. That's definitely one of the biggest errors in my head.
That's really good advice there, Ed. Thank you. Just move on to Fred, please.
Yeah. So again, right. I think Ed hit some really good points there. The other thing I would say is to understand, and I kind of hit on this earlier, right? To understand the linkage between the controls, how you validate and qualify those controls, and then the data that you have from that, like understand that feedback loop and understanding what that is, and understanding that there's some things that are linked that maybe you won't know until there is a failure, right? And that's the whole purpose of having, if you think about that visualization of the house of contamination control, right? That's why you have your change management process that feeds into those as a feedback loop. You have your deviation management that is a feedback loop. Because let's face it, if there was a silver bullet out there that we could go out and get to never have a contamination event, never have a deviation, I think we all would pay whatever we could for it, because it would make the process much, much simpler, much more straightforward, and be much better for the patient, right? But that doesn't exist because all processes are slightly different. So it's understanding and trying to make sure that you have that infinite mindset of continuously learning and understanding that it's just not a one and done, right? It's like, no, we're going to do this, and then there's going to be something that happens, and we're going to continuously learn from it. And then how do you build that knowledge management into your process, where it's the process that holds the information, and not, say, oh, hey, Fred's the guy that does that, right? And if he gets hit by a bus tomorrow, we're going to be in a world of trouble, right? Where it's like, make the process hold the information from a knowledge management standpoint to drive that continuous improvement process.
Okay, thank you. And Helen?
So I don't think I've got a great deal to add, because they're, really, really great points there. The only thing, I would say is the tick box exercise element of it. When I've been asked to look at contamination control strategies, and I've picked them up, and it's just a big table of a list of assessments with some actions in it, and there's no follow-up on those actions. There's no dates on them. It's just been done as a document, and that is it's just a real shame. It's a lost opportunity there for really gathering that understanding, utilizing it, and just making things better to get the best outcome for your product quality at the end of the process. So yeah, I would say, if you're going to do it, do it properly and make the most of it.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So unfortunately, our time is coming to an end. I hope everybody listening has gained some valuable insights into the CCS and feels a little bit more confident, or has a clearer path forward on what you need to do, or depending on how advanced you are in terms of benchmarking the CCS. Just in terms of takeaways, I've just scribbled down one point that each person has said, and there's been so many good things. So this is just what I've scribbled down. But from Ed, I've really, I think the point about a contamination control strategy is something distinct from a contamination control plan is a great point. I think Fred talking about prevention, removing and mitigating contamination, again, is something we can all really keep in our minds. And then with Helen's point about looking at consequences of risks and also learning from our data and what we find, again, is a great thing. So if, to my mind, if there's nothing else you take away from today, take those, but there was lots of other great things as well. So I'd like to thank Ed, Fred and Helen for taking the time out and to share their years of experience with us on this really important topic. And this brings this session to an end, and thank you, and everyone have a great day.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Tim, and thanks to all our speakers, Ed, Fred and Helen. It's been a fantastic session, lots of great takeaways for the audience there, and Tim, thanks for summarising some of the key points, but as you said, there's a lot more to take away. Our next session is going to be sticking on the microbiology theme. We've got a presentation on data integrity, which is another hot topic, from Miriam Guest, principal microbiologist at AstraZeneca. So I hope to see you there.